Shadow of Deception, Chapter 1. The Case. Begins Detective Nathan Holloway had seen it all. Liars, cheats, murderers. Infidelity cases were the easiest to crack, but the hardest to stomach. When Daniel Whitmore walked into his office that evening, Nathan already knew the story before the man even spoke. Daniel was in his late 30s, dressed in a crisp but slightly wrinkled suit, his face pale and drawn. His fingers trembled as he placed a manila envelope on Nathan's desk. "I think my wife is cheating on me," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. Nathan leaned back in his chair, eyes shifting from the envelope to the man before him. "What makes you think that?" Daniel hesitated. "She's been different, secretive, always on her phone, going out late. And then—" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "I followed her last week. She was with someone, I couldn't see who." Nathan reached for the envelope and flipped it open. Inside were photos, grainy, taken from a distance. A woman, auburn-haired and elegant, meeting a shadowed figure in dimly lit cafes and secluded parking lots. The images didn't reveal much, but Nathan's sharp eye caught the body language. She wasn't just talking to this man. She was with him. "I need proof," Daniel continued, his voice tightening. "I need to know who it is." Nathan studied the photographs again, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He quickly masked his expression before looking back up. "I'll find out," Nathan said, his voice steady. "I'll get you the truth." Chapter 2. The Investigation. Nathan Holloway had worked dozens of infidelity cases, but this one felt different. Maybe it was the desperation in Daniel's voice or the way Olivia Whitmore carried herself in those photographs, like she knew she was being watched. Regardless, a case was a case, and Nathan knew how to find answers. That night, he set up surveillance outside the Whitmore residence, an upscale townhouse in an affluent neighborhood. The windows glowed with warm light, and through the sheer curtains he caught glimpses of Olivia moving gracefully through the living room. She looked composed, too composed. At precisely 9:15 p.m., she stepped outside, wearing a black coat over a sleek dress. She glanced over her shoulder before getting into her silver sedan and pulling out of the driveway. Nathan followed, keeping a few cars behind. She drove across town, finally stopping at a dimly lit cafe. Nathan parked a block away and adjusted the zoom on his camera. Olivia entered and took a corner seat. A few minutes later, a man approached and sat across from her. His face remained hidden beneath the shadow of his baseball cap. Nathan snapped a few photos. Their body language was close, familiar. The man reached across the table, touching Olivia's hand briefly. She didn't pull away. Nathan's phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Any updates?" Nathan stared at the screen for a moment before typing, "Following a lead. We'll update soon." He kept watching. Olivia and the man talked for nearly an hour. When they left, Nathan discreetly followed them to a hotel on the outskirts of town. Olivia hesitated at the entrance, then disappeared inside with the mystery man. Nathan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. He should report back to Daniel. He should tell him his suspicions were confirmed. But he didn't. Instead, he closed. His eyes exhaled slowly and whispered to himself, this wasn't supposed to happen. Chapter 3. The Twist. Nathan sat in his car outside the hotel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had followed this routine countless times, watching, recording, reporting. But this case was different. This case was personal. The neon vacancy sign flickered against the rain-slicked pavement as he watched the entrance. Olivia and the mystery man had been inside for 20 minutes. It was more than enough time to confirm Daniel's worst fears. Nathan should take his photos, write his report, and let the case run its course. Instead, he found himself reaching for his phone. "Nathan, we need to talk. Now." Seconds later, his screen lit up with Olivia's response. "Olivia, Not now. It's too risky. Nathan clenched his jaw. His mind raced with a storm of conflicting emotions. He had spent weeks manipulating this case, controlling what Daniel saw, steering him toward a half-truth. But the walls were closing in. Olivia was getting careless. Daniel was growing suspicious. And the other investigator Daniel had hired? That was a problem Nathan hadn't anticipated. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. He needed to act before everything spiraled out of control. Leaving his car, he pulled his collar up against the wind and strode toward the hotel entrance. The receptionist barely glanced at him as he passed. He knew which room Olivia was in. He had watched her check in. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his pulse hammering in his ears. Room 214. Nathan knocked once. A heartbeat later, Olivia opened the door. Her eyes widened. "What the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, stepping back. Nathan entered, shutting the door behind him. Inside, the room was dimly lit. The bed was untouched, and a half-empty glass of wine sat on the nightstand. The so-called mystery man stood by the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Nathan's lips curled in frustration. "You're getting sloppy." Olivia folded her arms. "I told you we shouldn't meet like this anymore." Nathan glanced at the man by the window. "And he?" The man smirked. "Relax, Holloway. I'm just making sure she stays safe. You're not the only one with a plan here." Nathan stiffened. He didn't like unknown players in a game he had carefully orchestrated. Olivia stepped between them. "Daniel's close to figuring it out," she said, voice low. "He's hired another investigator." Nathan swore under his breath. "Who?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But if we don't act fast, this is all going to blow up in our faces." Nathan glanced at the stranger again, unease creeping up his spine. He had controlled the narrative so far, but now something was shifting. "Then we need to make sure Daniel never learns the truth," Nathan muttered. And just like that, the rules of the game changed. Chapter 4. Pieces falling into place. Nathan sat alone in his car, staring at the rain-speckled windshield, his thoughts tangled in a web of lies. The hotel meeting had changed everything. Olivia was growing anxious. The unknown man was a wild card. And Daniel was dangerously close to unraveling the truth. For the first time, Nathan felt like he was losing control. He checked his phone. No new messages. Olivia had gone silent since their conversation. He couldn't tell if she was following orders or if she was reconsidering everything. That was the problem with playing. Both sides, sooner or later, someone flipped the board. Nathan had to stay ahead. His next stop was Daniel's house. He needed to keep him on the leash a little longer, feed him just enough information to keep him running in circles. But as he approached the quiet suburban street, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. Daniel's porch light was on, and through the bay window, Nathan saw him sitting at the dining table, his head bowed, hands gripping a folder, a case file. Nathan killed the engine and took a deep breath. Stay calm. Stay in control. He stepped out, walking up the path as though he had nothing to hide. Daniel opened the door before he could knock. His face was pale, his eyes dark with suspicion. "Come in," he said, his voice stiff. Nathan followed him inside, scanning the room. A glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table. The case file lay open, pages spread across the surface. Nathan's pulse quickened. "This doesn't add up, Nathan," Daniel said, turning to face him. "Your reports, the surveillance, the gaps in the timeline." He tapped one of the pages. "I hired someone else to cross-check your work." Nathan forced a casual smile. "And?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "And he says some of these photos could be staged. He says the timestamps don't match." His jaw clenched. "He thinks you might be involved." A slow silence stretched between them. Nathan's hand inched toward his pocket. Feeling the reassuring weight of his gun, He tilted his head slightly, his voice dangerously low. "That's quite an accusation, Daniel." Daniel's grip tightened on the file. "Tell me I'm wrong." Nathan held his gaze, the moment stretching unbearably. Then he sighed and shook his head. "I really wish you hadn't figured it out." Daniel's eyes widened, just as Nathan lunged. Chapter 5. A Fatal Miscalculation. Daniel barely had time to react before Nathan lunged at him. The folder slipped from his hands, papers scattering across the floor. He stumbled back, colliding with the dining table, but Nathan was faster, gripping him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Daniel gasped, his fingers scrambling to pry Nathan's hand away. "What the hell? Why couldn't you just let it go?" Nathan hissed. His voice was calm, but his grip tightened. "You hired me to investigate Olivia. I gave you the answers you needed. But no, you had to dig deeper." Daniel's eyes burned with confusion and fear. You were supposed to be my friend." Nathan's jaw clenched. "I was never your friend, Daniel." The words cut deeper than any punch could. Daniel struggled harder now, adrenaline kicking in as the betrayal sunk in. He threw a wild elbow, catching Nathan's ribs, forcing him to loosen his grip. Daniel staggered away, coughing, but Nathan was already reaching for his gun. Daniel saw the movement, his eyes darting to the drawer behind him, where he kept his own weapon. A split-second decision. He dove. Nathan fired. The gunshot roared through the house. For a moment, silence. Then, Daniel groaned, clutching his side. The bullet had grazed him, but he was still moving. Nathan cursed under his breath and raised the gun again. Before he could fire, Daniel twisted, knocking over a chair and sending it crashing into Nathan's legs. He stumbled just enough for Daniel to lunge forward, grabbing the gun with both hands. A brutal struggle. Grunts, fists, the scent of gunpowder and sweat. Nathan used his weight, slamming Daniel against the wall again, trying to pry the gun free. But Daniel wouldn't let go. He gritted his teeth, using every ounce of his strength. Bang! Both men froze. A single gunshot. For a moment, neither of them knew who had been hit. Then, Nathan staggered back, his free hand clutching his stomach. His knees buckled and he collapsed onto the floor, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. A dark stain spread across his shirt. Daniel fell back against the wall, his own body shaking, his hands gripping the gun that had just saved his life. Nathan looked up at him, his face twisted, not with pain, but with something almost amused. A weak chuckle escaped his lips. "You really didn't see it coming, did you?" Nathan muttered. His fingers trembled, stained with his own blood. "Damn shame. I was playing such a good game." Daniel's chest heaved as he stared down at the man who had been investigating his wife, who had been sleeping with her, who had betrayed him in ways he never imagined. And now, he was dying on his living room floor. Nathan coughed, his breath faltering. His body slumped. Daniel took a slow, shaky step forward, his heart pounding. He nudged Nathan's arm with his foot. No reaction. The game was over. Daniel exhaled heavily and reached for his phone, his fingers barely steady enough to dial. 911. "What's your emergency?" Daniel swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "There's been a shooting. I need an ambulance." His eyes remained locked on Nathan's motionless body as he whispered, almost to himself, "I need to know if he's really dead." Chapter 6. The Aftermath. The sirens screamed through the quiet suburban street, their red and blue lights casting frantic shadows against the walls of Daniel's home. He stood motionless, gun still clutched in his shaking hands, staring down. At Nathan's unmoving body, the front door burst open. "Drop the weapon!" Daniel barely registered the voice before his instincts kicked in. He let the gun slip from his fingers, raising his hands. Two officers rushed in, weapons drawn, scanning the room. One of them kicked the gun away, while the other checked Nathan's. "Pulse! He's still breathing!" the officer called out. Daniel inhaled sharply, his head spinning. "He's alive!" Within moments, paramedics flooded the house, kneeling beside Nathan's body, his blood soaked into the floor, but his chest still moved, barely. The medics worked quickly, stabilizing him, pressing gauze to the wound. "Sir, you need to come with us," an officer said, gripping Daniel's arm. Daniel's mind was a fog of disbelief. He barely heard his own voice when he said, He tried to kill me. Did you shoot him?" The cop pressed. Daniel swallowed hard. "It was a struggle. The gun went off." The cop studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You'll need to give a full statement at the station." As they led him outside, the cool night air hit Daniel like a slap. Neighbors stood on their lawns whispering, their faces bathed in flashing red and blue light. The entire street had come alive with morbid curiosity. Daniel's gaze drifted to the ambulance. The paramedics lifted Nathan's stretcher inside. Just before the doors closed, he saw Nathan's fingers twitch. A chilling realization settled over him. Nathan had played him from the beginning, lied to him, betrayed him, nearly killed him, and now he might survive. Daniel wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Chapter 7. The game isn't over. Daniel sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his fingers drumming anxiously against the steel table. The past few hours had been a blur of flashing lights, sirens, and endless questioning. Now all he could do was wait. The door creaked open. A detective stepped inside, a thick case file in his hands. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his expression unreadable. He dropped the file onto the table and took a seat across from Daniel. "Detective Carter," he introduced himself. His tone was calm, almost conversational. "You've had quite a night, Mr. Whitaker." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "That's one way to put it." Carter leaned back in his chair, flipping through the file. "We've got your 911 call. The officers on the scene confirmed the gunshot wound was inflicted during a struggle. For now, your story holds." He glanced up. "But something doesn't add up." Daniel swallowed hard. "Like what?" Carter studied him. "Nathan Holloway, private investigator, former cop. Been in the game for over a decade. The kind of guy who knows how to cover his tracks." He paused, tapping his fingers on the table. "And yet, here we are. He gets caught red-handed, turns violent, and nearly gets himself killed. That doesn't sound like the Nathan Holloway I've heard about." Daniel shifted in his seat. "Are you saying he wanted to get caught?" Carter didn't answer right. Away. Instead, he slid a photograph across the table. Daniel hesitated before picking it up. His breath caught in his throat. It was Olivia. She was walking down a hospital hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a grim line. "She showed up an hour ago," Carter said. "Went straight to Nathan's room." Daniel's grip tightened on the photo. "Why would she—" "Here's the part that's really interesting," Carter interrupted. He slid another paper across the table, a medical report. "Holloway lost a lot of blood, but he's stable. And the first thing he did when he woke—" "Up?" Daniel's eyes flicked up. "He asked for a lawyer." Silence. The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing against Daniel's chest. Carter leaned forward, his voice lowering. "I don't think Nathan Holloway was just covering up an affair. I think he was playing a much bigger game, and I think Olivia is still a part of it." Daniel clenched his jaw. His thoughts were racing. Olivia had gone to see Nathan. Nathan was still alive. And now he was lawyering up. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't over. Nathan had lost a battle tonight, but the war was far from finished. Chapter 8. A War in the Shadows. Daniel sat in his car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The storm of emotions swirling inside him, rage, betrayal, uncertainty, left him paralyzed. Olivia was here. She had come straight to him. Nathan Holloway, the man who had lied to him, manipulated him, tried to kill him, and Olivia was at his bedside. Daniel exhaled, trying to steady his pulse, but the betrayal cut too deep. He needed answers. The hospital parking lot was quiet. The late hour meant fewer people, making it easier to slip inside unnoticed. He pulled his hood up, keeping his head down as he walked. Through the automatic doors, past the bored receptionist, toward the ICU. Nathan's room was at the end of the hallway. A single security guard stood near the door, but he looked half asleep, barely paying attention. Daniel kept his distance, watching from behind a vending machine. Then, Olivia emerged. She stepped out of Nathan's room and paused, pressing her fingertips to her temples as if she had a pounding headache. She looked exhausted, nervous, guilty. Daniel's heart pounded as he took a careful step forward. She turned suddenly, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Daniel?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear or regret, maybe both. His jaw tightened. "Tell me you're not serious." She glanced toward Nathan's room, then back at Daniel. "This isn't what you think." "Oh?" He scoffed, stepping closer. "Because I think my wife's been sneaking around with the man who lied to me. The man who tried to put a bullet in my head." His voice darkened. "And I think she's still protecting him." Olivia swallowed hard, her hands trembling. I can't talk here." Daniel stared at her, his breath shallow. He had spent weeks trying to uncover the truth about Olivia's affair, only to find out the man investigating her was the real threat. And now, after everything, she was still hiding something. His voice dropped to a near growl. "You owe me the truth." Olivia's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, needed to say something, but then a voice interrupted them. "Well, well," Daniel tensed. The guard at the door was now wide awake, his posture alert, but it wasn't him who had spoken, it was Nathan. The hospital room door was slightly ajar, and from his bed with an oxygen tube in his nose and bandages wrapped around his torso, Nathan Holloway grinned at Daniel like the devil himself. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Nathan murmured. His voice was weaker than before, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, still held the same dangerous glint. Daniel's blood ran cold. Nathan was still in the game, and Olivia, she was caught somewhere in the middle. Chapter 9. The Truth. Beneath the lies, Daniel's fists clenched at his sides as he took a slow step toward Nathan's hospital bed. The beeping of the monitors filled the silence between them, punctuating the tension like a countdown to something inevitable. Olivia hovered near the door, her expression tight with worry, but Daniel barely spared her a glance. "You're awake," Daniel said, his voice dangerously low. "Shame." Nathan let out a breathy chuckle. "You wound me, Danny." He winced, shifting slightly. "Well, more than you already did." Daniel took another step closer, gripping the rail of Nathan's bed. "Tell me why she's here." Nathan's smirk faltered just slightly, but before he could speak, Olivia cut in. "Daniel, listen to me." "Not now," he snapped, his gaze never leaving Nathan's. "He's been lying to me from the beginning. He used me. And now, after everything, you're still protecting him?" Olivia inhaled sharply, but Nathan lifted a weak hand. "Let her talk." Daniel gritted his teeth, but something in Olivia's face, something raw and desperate, made him hesitate. She stepped forward. "You think I came here for him?" Her voice shook slightly. "I came here for you." Daniel's brows furrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" She swallowed hard. "Nathan wasn't investigating me because you hired him." Daniel's pulse quickened. "What?" She glanced at Nathan, then back at Daniel. "He was investigating you first." Daniel felt the ground beneath him shift. That's a lie. Nathan exhaled, looking almost amused. I wish it was. Daniel's chest tightened. His mind raced, trying to fit the pieces together. Why? Nathan's smirk faded. Because someone else hired me to look into you? Silence. The hospital room suddenly felt suffocating. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Who? Nathan's tired eyes flicked to Olivia. And that's when Daniel realized Olivia already knew. His breath hitched. Olivia. She hesitated, but the truth was already there, plain as day. You did? This? His voice cracked, disbelief cutting through him like a blade. You hired him? I didn't know it was him, she said quickly. I swear, Daniel, Daniel staggered back a step, his mind spinning. You investigated me? His laugh was hollow. After everything, you're the one who didn't trust me? Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. It wasn't like that. Daniel shook his head. Then what was it like? Nathan groaned, shifting in his bed. This is touching, really, but maybe we save the marital spat for later? He tilted, his head. Because, Danny, your wife isn't the only one who wanted dirt on you. Daniel barely heard him. His thoughts were fixated on Olivia, on the way her lips trembled, on the way her hands twisted together. She wasn't denying it. Nathan. His voice was eerily calm. Who else? Nathan met his gaze, his smirk returning. This time, almost pitying. Someone who wants you gone. Daniel's heart pounded. The affair, the investigation, the lies. This wasn't just about Olivia. This was bigger, and he had no idea who was pulling the strings.